From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Eric Weiner is a wanderer, a searcher for God, for genius, for happiness. Fortunately for us, he takes us on his journeys and we get to see his humor, his curiosity, his deep intelligence. In his book, Man Seeks God, he went in search of the divine, traveling to Nepal to try Buddhism, to the Bronx to mix with the Franciscans, to China to take in the Taoists, and to Israel to plunge into the Kabbalah. In a search for happiness, Weiner again traveled far and wide, seeking to discover the happiest place on the planet. Perhaps not surprisingly, he found that happiness is not a place, but a state of mind. And the things that people normally think bring us happiness do not. If money were the key, why do people living in humble circumstances in Latin America say that they're very happy? In his latest book, The Geography of Genius, Weiner sets off on another worldly quest to find the wellspring of genius. And he comes to the realization that genius is not necessarily what we have always imagined it to be. Of course, we have our solitary, tortured geniuses, Van Gogh, Mozart, Da Vinci. But Weiner looks beyond the individual to the times and places that gave birth to genius. And he discovers that genius often arose after a period of hardship, chaos, and uncertainty. In many cases, a mixing of different cultures was a contributing factor. Before he combed the world as an author, Weiner was foreign correspondent for NPR, reporting from more than 30 countries. Now, please join me in welcoming Eric Weiner.
Wow. I think I may have to add a chapter to my book about the geography of genius and include this room, because I sense a lot of genius out there. Steve, thank you for that great introduction. I think you did neatly sort of sum up what I do, because it's not always easy to explain to people what I do. When you have to fill out the forms and put occupation, I usually write philosophical traveler. This confuses people at the IRS and makes you subject to audits, But that really is what I'm doing, is I'm looking for the intersection of place and idea. And I've always been a traveler, and I've always done my best thinking on the road, ever since I was 5 years old, and I ran away from home, true story, and I got a good 1.5 miles away from home and would have made it to wherever it was I was trying to get to had Baltimore County Police not decided to, I thought a bit impetuously, intervene with my little adventure. But ever since I've been wandering, and as Steve said, looking at big ideas like happiness, like spirituality, and now like genius. Not just any ideas, ideas where I feel that the role of place, of geography in the biggest sense of the word, is often overlooked. And I do think that is the case with genius, because there are a lot of theories/myths surrounding genius. It's a big word, right? It comes to us like so many words from Latin, but the Latin notion of genius was that it was not something you achieved, it was something that accompanied you, a sort of presiding spirit or deity that followed you around. You had your genius sort of travel with you everywhere. And today, it means lots of things, right? It might mean someone with a really high IQ, or someone who's a really know-it-all. That's not the definition I'm working with. I believe that genius is not a know-it-all. A genius is a see-it-all, someone who sees connections. Someone who is creative, really. Creative genius. But where do these creative geniuses come from? Well, myth number one, and I use the term myth in sort of the Joseph Campbell sense, is it's something that can be very empowering and perhaps partially true, but not 100% true. Myth number one is that geniuses are born. They just pop out of the womb, fully brilliant. Think of Mozart as sort of the poster child for this theory. Playing the violin at age 3 and composing at age 8. It must have been that he was born that way, right? Ignoring the fact that his father, Leopold Mozart, was one of the premier violin instructors and musicians of the time, and then he was growing up in a very musical era in a very musical city of Salzburg. So I don't believe that genetics accounts for as much as we think of the genius puzzle. And the second myth, again in quotes, is that geniuses are made through hard work, right? It's the 10,000-hour theory, which you may be familiar with. Put in at least 10,000 hours of work over 10 years, and you'll have at least a chance of achieving excellence, if not genius. Well, I know a lot of hardworking people in North Korea with good genes who aren't achieving genius. And there have been plenty of hardworking women in ages past who did not achieve the status of genius because they weren't recognized and they weren't given the opportunity. I don't think genetics and hard work alone explains it. In fact, I began to think about this, and I thought, well, what if geniuses are not born? What if they're not made? What if they're grown? What if it's actually in the soil? Think about, growing an apple tree, right? You need to have the seed, good quality seed. You need to put in some hard work planting it. That's the work part. But you need to have the right soil, or you're not going to have an apple tree. So, in fact, as I investigated this, if you look at a map of the world over the course of history and you were to plot the appearance of geniuses, of the Beethovens and the Einsteins and others throughout history, you wouldn't find them appearing randomly. One in Belgrade, one in Vienna, one in Alexandria, maybe 2 in Alexandria, I don't know. But you don't, what you find is that they are in these groupings, genius clusters, I call them, right? Certain places at certain times have just been very good at producing brilliant minds and good ideas. And the question is why? What was in the water back then? And for selfish reasons, we want to know, can we bottle it, right? I'm interested in the history, but it's sort of applied history. What are the lessons for us today? So I came up with a list of 7 golden ages, ranging from ancient Athens to Silicon Valley. Some of them were pretty well known to most of my readers, I think, such as Athens during the classical period, Florence during the Renaissance. Others were maybe not as well known, such as Edinburgh in the 18th century, in the time of the Scottish Enlightenment, or Vienna, which had a rare double dip of genius, which I'll talk about both in Mozart and Beethoven's time and then in Freud's time in around 1900. And some of the places I chose are really, for most readers, terra incognita, I would say. Hangzhou, China in the 13th century, an amazing, amazing genius cluster that we don't, in the West at least, know much about. Or Calcutta, yes, Calcutta in India in the late 19th, early 20th century, home of the Bengal Renaissance, where more books were published than any city in the world except for London, and produced the first non-Westerner to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, Rabindranath Tagore. And then I bring the book home to Silicon Valley because I wanted to bring it home, and I wanted to bring it to a current place of genius. So a word about what the academics would call methodology and what I like to call how I do stuff. Here's my sort of philosophy of travel. Read about a place before you go there, but don't read too much. I would read lots of histories before I would go somewhere, but I didn't want to read other contemporary authors' accounts because I wanted to have a fresh take on places. I also am a loiterer. I will go someplace and spend more time than I think I need to spend there. Now, the challenge for me in this book was writing about the past. In my previous books, I've written about contemporary India or Bhutan or Iceland. The past, it's been said, is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And it's true. So the challenge was to make these places come alive. I suppose I could have written this entire book without leaving, say, the Library of Congress. But that's not the way I roll. I feel, because people have asked me that question, like, well, did you need to go to Athens? And the answer is yes. I think to walk in the footsteps of Socrates or Plato or Herodotus and to experience the place they experienced is vitally important. So I want to give you a quick world tour of some of the places I visited, what I found, and then open it up to questions. So I start in Athens, and Athens is a mystery, okay? It's a mystery because of all the places to produce so much genius in such a short period of time, you wouldn't necessarily choose Athens, because remember, there were hundreds and hundreds of these Greek city-states, hundreds of Greeces, little microcultures. And Athens did not have the most going for it compared to these other places. So I'm just going to read a little section to give you a sense of my task, what I was up to, and what I found out about Athens. As I said, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Yes, they do. And unfortunately, this particular foreign country known as ancient Greece has extremely tight border controls. It doesn't take kindly to interlopers such as me. Yet if I'm going to solve the Athenian mystery, the past is exactly where I need to be. What to do? Squint. That was the advice of a friend back home when I'd mentioned my plans to visit Athens. I'd laughed it off, but now I realize it's actually a smart tactic. Sometimes we can see more by narrowing our field of view than by expanding it. The zoom lens reveals as much as the wide angle, and sometimes more. Don't squint too much, Aristotle warns. I should say that Aristotle is the name of my guide in Athens. Talk about a wonderful piece of serendipity. It's kind of a burden, though, when your name is Aristotle. And I really thought at first, well, this is great. And he's like, it's not so great. People assume great wisdom on his part. And he's plenty smart, but, you don't want that name. If I could time travel, he says, to Athens circa 450 BC, I'd probably be disappointed. The great Athens, the cradle of Western civilization, the birthplace of science, philosophy, and so much else we hold dear, was a dump. The streets were narrow and dirty. The houses, constructed of wood and sun-dried clay, were so flimsy that robbers gained entry by simply digging. In fact, the ancient Greek word for robber means literally one who tunnels through walls. As a time traveler, I would definitely notice the noise, vendors hawking their wares at the agora, a lute screeching off-key. But what would grab my attention and not let go is the stench. People relieved themselves in the courtyard of their own home, or even right in the streets where the mess would sit until a slave sluiced it away. Conditions were such that, as historian Jacob Burckhardt put it, no sensible and peaceful person of our day would want to live under them. And he wrote those words, by the way, in the 19th century. So this is one of the great myths of these places of genius, is that they're paradise, that they're really nice places. They're not. They're difficult places. I really believe that one of the keys to creativity is that we need constraints. We need something to push against. And paradise, if it does exist, and I hope it does, is probably the least creative place in the universe, because you don't have that need to create something. You don't have that something to push against. There was one very interesting study done by a psychologist where he gave two groups of people an assignment to build a collage. But one group was given a very limited number of materials and limited number of options of how they could work with these materials. And the other was given a whole bunch of material and lots of options. And it was that first group with the greater constraints who produced the more creative, as judged by a panel, collages. We need something to push against. And we need that sort of messiness. I don't know about the stench, but the messiness that you had in Athens, because creativity and creative genius is not a neat process. There is a messiness to it, and that's why you often see a relationship between chaos and creativity. If you think about it, if you're going from the old way of thinking to the new way of thinking, you need to pass through an intermediate stage, and that intermediate stage is chaos. A neuroscientist named Walter Freeman studied the brains of rabbits. No rabbits were harmed in these experiments, I just want you to know, because I always feel uncomfortable with that. But he hooked up their little rabbit brains to EEGs, and he introduced them to odors, and some odors they were quite familiar with, and other odors they were new to them. Well, when they saw a familiar odor, the EEG had a regular readout. When they were introduced to an unfamiliar odor, they saw a very chaotic state on the EEG. And Freeman called that very interestingly the I don't know state. And that I don't know state is essential for creative genius. And it's essential that these places nurture it, cultivate it. One thing I should add about all these places they have in common is they're almost all cities. If it takes a village to raise a child, as the African proverb goes, it takes a city to make a genius. I won't say to raise a genius, but to cultivate a genius. Because cities provide the opportunities, cities provide the audience, which is hugely important. And a city like Athens had the one single trait that psychologists have identified as the most important trait for creative people, and I would argue for creative places, and that is this: openness to experience. Openness to experience. And the manifestation of that in ancient Athens was the port of Piraeus. And they went out and they sailed, and here's one of the dirty little secrets about the ancient Greeks. They mooched. They were tremendous moochers. They borrowed ideas, statuary from the Egyptians, and mathematics from elsewhere. As Plato said, though, what the Greeks borrow, very nice way of putting it, or steal from foreigners, they perfect. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, as the historian Will Durant said something that at first I found disturbing and later I've come to embrace. He said, nothing is new but the arranging. Nothing is new but the arranging. At first as a writer I thought, oh shoot, well, I've got nothing new to say. But then I realized there's great beauty in the arranging, you know, in the rearranging. You could probably find every word that I have in this book somewhere out there in other books scattered around the world, but not arranged in the particular way I've arranged them. So genius is about the art of stealing and borrowing as well. And just this is going to be a quick whirlwind tour, but let's talk about another well-known place, which is Florence, right? A couple interesting things about Florence in the Italian Renaissance. One is that it was born out of catastrophe. That the Italian Renaissance, which started in Florence, started not more than a few decades after the outbreak of the bubonic plague known as the Black Death, which was horrible, which was terrible, which should not be wished on any society. But it had this effect of shaking up the culture, of making it less rigid. And some historians believe, and I subscribe to this, that it was that shaking up that ultimately led to the flourishing known as the Renaissance. And the other interesting thing about the Italian Renaissance is the role that money played in it. Now, we have this very romantic notion of the starving artist. Forget it. Starving artist doesn't produce anything except his own or her own misery. They're just worried about their next meal. So some degree of money is required. And this is where patronage comes into play. And it took the form of one particular family, the Medici, who it's not enough just to throw money around. You have to know what you're doing, and they knew what they were doing. And there's a great story about Lorenzo Medici, who was known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. I think it said it on his business card. I think that's just how he went by. And one day he's walking outside the sort of palace grounds in the Medici gardens, and he sees this young stonecutter who can't be more than 14 years old, working on a sort of rudimentary statue of a faun, a Roman deity. And Lorenzo, who's getting a bit up there in age by now, says, well, it's pretty good, kid, but you know, it's an older faun, and its teeth, though, are new. When you're an older man like me, your teeth don't look so new. And he walked away. Comes back the next day, Lorenzo does, and notices the kid has perfected the teeth and put in a little tooth decay and and really created something special. And Lorenzo sort of on the spot takes a chance, makes an investment in that kid and says, you come live with me, basically live with me, become a part of my family, essentially. I'm going to give you the best access to teachers and to materials and the highest challenges. And it was a very wise investment because today that kid goes by just one name usually, Michelangelo. Now we think of Michelangelo as the genius. He's well known. Lorenzo the Magnificent, less so. But you could argue that without Lorenzo and his patronage, there would be no Michelangelo. And you could argue that the real genius was Lorenzo. You could also argue, as I would, that the real genius was the city of Florence and their appreciation and their willingness to make bets like that. Another Michelangelo story is Pope Julius II was looking to have some ceiling work done on the Sistine Chapel. So he sends out bids to contractors, essentially, but he chose Michelangelo, which was, now we look back and say, well, that's such an obvious choice. It wasn't at the time. You know, Michelangelo was mainly a statue maker. He was, you know, a sculptor rather. He was not so much of a painter. But that, I think, is something essential and something we've lost a bit on. That's making a big bet on someone who's not the exact fit for the job. Think of how many jobs today, like we look to hire someone who's done that exact same job previously. But the Pope, who was a Medici from the family, took a bet on Michelangelo, and it paid off tremendously. Other places, Hangzhou, China. So in the 13th century, you know, Europe is pretty backward. You know, they're picking fleas out of each other's hair and wondering when the Dark Ages are ever going to end. This is just going on too long. But at the time, Hangzhou is a flourishing city of 1 million people, you know, or more. And it is just taking off. And they're sailing ships that are unlike anything the Europeans have done. And it's ruled, no joke, by a group of poet emperors. That's nice, you know. It's you know, wouldn't the world be a better place if it was run by poet politicians or poet philosophers? And the striking thing is that there's sort of a top-down approach. This is often the way China works, is that a Chinese person said, well, we play follow the leader. And I thought, really? But if you think about it, when the emperor's a poet, it's going to filter down. So there's a tremendous amount of poetry and writing and scientific research going on. And it has the characteristic of all of these places of genius, and that is that it is extremely interdisciplinary. People are crossing boundaries. So I want to share with you just one section where I'm looking at the work of someone named Su Dongpo. Now, in addition to being a poet and a painter, Su, who's still revered in Hangzhou, by the way, was a governor and an accomplished engineer. His best-known project was a causeway that traversed West Lake and still does today. Su was a Renaissance man 300 years before the Renaissance. So as I step out of this small museum or admiring his work to this bright sky in the city of Hangzhou, I find myself wondering, why aren't there more people like that today? Why must we sequester our ambitions? I answer my own question by imagining what would happen if a polymath like Su Dongpo walked onto a modern college campus. Is it literature you're interested in, Mr. Su? Oh, well, then please see the School of Humanities. Oh, what's that? You're a painter? Well, please drop by the Department of Fine Arts. I'm sorry, it's engineering that piques your interest? Well, we have an excellent school for that, too. But I want to do it all, says Su. I'm sorry, Mr. Su, we can't help you there. Please return when you've clarified your career objectives. Meanwhile, if you like, I can direct you to mental health services. You see, we don't often question the rationale for specialization. Of course, there was less specialization back then, a friend told me at a dinner party. The world was less complicated. It was. But I would argue that the world was less complicated because there was less specialization. The specialist is encouraged rewarded for parsing his chosen field into smaller and smaller morsels, then building high walls around these tiny bits. A narrow outlook naturally follows. We mourn the death of the Renaissance man and woman, oblivious to the blindingly obvious fact that we killed him and continue to do so every day on college campuses and in corporate offices across the land. And I think that is one reason why we are arguably, and it's arguably, seeing fewer creative breakthroughs today. Because, as I said before, the genius is not a know-it-all. The genius is a see-it-all. There were physicists during the time of Einstein who knew more physics than Einstein did, but they weren't able to make those connections that he was able to make. And what you see, let's time travel a few hundred years past Hangzhou to Vienna now of 1900. And this was an incredible flourishing. You had the art movement with Gustav Klimt, you had physicists like Ernst Mach, you had philosophers, you had writers like Arthur Schnitzler, and you had Sigmund Freud. So what often happens when you have sparks flying in lots of different directions is a fire of creativity ignites. So if you're Sigmund Freud and you're sitting there in Vienna and you see a new art movement, the secessionist movement, and you see new developments in the worlds of philosophy and mathematics, you start to think on an unconscious level that, as Freud would put it, that, well, why not in my field too? Because creativity is contagious. There is a contagion effect. And that's why I think it's very important for places like Silicon Valley to not just do technology, right? But to have a thriving art scene there for selfish reasons. In addition to art being beautiful and wonderful, is it actually is going to help the technology field. Because these lines we think are so solid are not, in fact. So a couple words about Silicon Valley, then I do want to take your questions. It was probably the hardest chapter for me to write, to be honest, because it's not done yet. There's no period at the end of it. People are familiar with it more than they are with Hangzhou, so they think they know what makes Silicon Valley tick. I went there with a completely open mind. I did not talk to technology people because not exclusively, because Silicon Valley actually has very little to do with technology. I really believe that. The product is technology, yes, but the process is cultural, right? So I hung out with anthropologists, and there are some anthropologists there who are sort of the Margaret Meads of Silicon Valley, who look at the locals and their strange customs and what they do. And what Silicon Valley is very good at is it actually resembles a lot of these ancient golden ages in some ways. You have that mooching going on, that borrowing ideas. Actually, very little, relatively little, was invented in Silicon Valley. Not the cell phone, which was invented in a suburb of Chicago. Not venture capital, which came from New York. But there is a system in Silicon Valley for, let's just say for what's the hot word these days, curating these ideas. So as much as places of genius are magnets for good ideas, they also need to be colanders to sift out the good from the bad, right? So Jonas Salk, two-time Nobel Prize winner, no slouch, was once asked by a young student, Dr. Salk, how do you come up with so many good ideas? He said, well, it's easy. I come up with lots of ideas and I throw away the bad ones, right? That element of discernment is hugely important and often overlooked. We think that, in order to have a creative atmosphere, you need to be tolerant. Well, yeah, you need to be tolerant, but you need to be discerning in that tolerance. You can't treat all ideas as equally good. And the question is, will Silicon Valley last? And that's something I discovered about these golden ages is they don't last that long. They're very fragile. Like there's one element in the periodic table, I forget its name, but it's so unstable it lasts about 10 seconds and then poof, it's gone. And these golden ages are almost like that because they're these Goldilocks places where they need to achieve this sweet spot, and it's very hard to maintain. And that tension that I talked about, and that sort of chaos that drives it, can ultimately tear it apart. And I conclude that really what leads to the demise of these places is really one word, arrogance. They become arrogant. And if you're arrogant, you're not ignorant. And if you're not ignorant, you're not going to produce anything worthwhile. You need to know what you don't know. You need to know the unknown unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld once said. It really is important to maintain that openness to experience. So ancient Athens, becomes closed off. They believe they have all the answers, and then it starts to decline. And you see this time and again happening with places. So my advice to Silicon Valley would be to remain open-minded and to really, in the conclusion of the book, I always wrestle with this. I'm someone who really, I'm really in my element when it comes to contradictions. I really relish contradictions and trying to hold two contradictory ideas in my head at the same time without my head exploding. But there is, I'm just being honest here, a pressure to tie things up in a neat bow. People want to know what the answer is. Like, what is the special sauce that if you were going to create a Silicon Valley or an ancient Athens from zero, like Frankenstein's monster only in a good way, what would you do? So I'm here to tell you that if I knew that answer, I'm here to tell you I would not be here telling you. I would be on a yacht in the Mediterranean sipping a drink with an umbrella in it, because I would be very, very wealthy, right? And there have been all these attempts to recreate Silicon Valley, and they all fail, right? Because they're trying to recreate a culture, and culture is more organic than that. Having said that, I do provide the 3 Ds at the end, with a bonus 4th D thrown in, no extra charge. And this is what I think these places have in common. Number 1 is diversity. Diversity not only ethnically, in fact, I wouldn't even say ethnic diversity is the most important kind of diversity I'm talking about, but intellectual diversity. Having a lot of different ideas, having that tolerance and that openness to other ideas. And the 2nd D is discernment, right? So you've got this openness, you're letting everything in, but you're discerning, and you're willing to, as I believe was that poet Allen Ginsberg said, kill your darlings, brutally. Make it look like an accident if you have to, but, but you need to separate the good ideas from the bad ideas. The 3rd D is disorder, which makes some people uncomfortable because they think, well, we need order, we need to have things just working in a certain way, especially corporations. We need a system. But in fact, there's always that element of disorder and even chaos, if you will, because a chaotic setting, you're getting lots of sensory input. You have lots of, say, molecules bouncing off of each other in a small space. They're more likely to form new combinations. That's why, one of the reasons why density is important for creative places. They're not density alone, because prisons are dense places, but not particularly creative. No, seriously. And I think it's actually more nuanced. I think you need density and you need trust of one another. You need intimacy in the best sense of the word. And in these places, these genius clusters, you had people, fellow geniuses, co-geniuses, who were intimate with each other, who were competitive, but in a healthy way. And the bonus D, because really everything has to be in 3s, like top 3 ways. No one ever has top 4. But I realize the bonus D is discomfort, right? You need to be a little bit uncomfortable. You need to be challenged. Most geniuses come from the middle and upper middle classes, not from the aristocracy. I hope I've given you something to think about, made you a little bit uncomfortable, but not too uncomfortable. And with that, I welcome your questions about anything at all. We have microphones, I believe. Oh, yes.
Hi.
Hi.
I think it's on, yeah. I think you were alluding to where my question here. In the actual geography of the places, was there anything you discerned? And I mean, you talked about density, but
right.
The actual
well,
climate.
As far as like topography,
yeah.
Which I do look at, like I arrive in Athens, and the light strikes you immediately. It's very stark and beautiful, brilliant light, and did that somehow make a difference? But then you think of what about Elizabethan London? That's dreary, and it produced Shakespeare. So just as in geography of bliss, I can include, weather doesn't explain happiness. I don't think that climate explains genius. You can be a genius in a rainy place or a sunny place. But I think the role that topography, say, played in ancient Athens is that, the rocky, hilly terrain sort of cut off all these city-states from one another, so it allowed those different petri dishes to grow. And I think that was very important. And people can be inspired by landscape, and they can go out into the desert to have their creative epiphany. But they always will return to a city, like Beethoven would go off for these walks in the Wienerwald, the woods outside of Vienna, and he got a lot of his ideas there. But he always returned to the city because that's where his audience was. That's where his patrons were. And so I've noticed that there's always this toggling, between countryside and city, between being very social and being alone. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, he'd do these mind experiments for days at a time, just staying in his apartment, not leaving, in his head. But then he would write about how he desperately needed to get to the pub, have a stiff drink, and socialize with people. So I think geniuses are very good at toggling. Thank you.
I don't know. Oh, there it is. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about Richard Florida and the creative class and the idea that, in some of his writings, and the idea that people are choosing to live, smart, creative people are choosing to live in environments that are supporting of that. So that's sort of, it's kind of more an American-focused, current-focused outlook.
Yeah.
That's my first question. And the second question is, you are in Washington after all, and I was wondering if you have contemplated, and perhaps this is an oxymoron, but is there anything you might say about the creation of genius in government?
Genius in government.
Thank you.
I'm familiar with Richard Florida's ideas, and I think some of them are quite good. I think he's right about urban density, but I think his explanation is incomplete because it misses that intimacy I talked about. I think the creative class is true up to a point. There are creative people who are attracted to certain environments, but what I think he misses is that discomfort part, that by the time places become nice enough, in quotes, nice to attract creative people, they're no longer creative. Thus the exodus from, say, Soho to Brooklyn to maybe Queens, or who knows what's happening in New York now. It's one thing to say, okay, to have nice sushi restaurants and ethnic restaurants and some theater, but creative people are creating that. They're not drawn necessarily to something that exists already. I think he underestimates the role of a challenge, that on the cusp when, now I guess it's hip to live in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, but for a while it was edgy, and so those people were not necessarily following Richard Florida's rule of the creative class being drawn to the bonbons of these, cultural bonbons that these places offer. I think creative people are motivated by a challenge more than by nice things. The tolerance part, he's right about, though. Yes.
Hi. Thank you for your time. I was hoping to learn a little bit more about your thoughts on gentrification and how that impacts the genius of a place. It seems really relevant to Silicon Valley and narrowing that's happened there, and I'm wondering if you've learned anything about places being either more or less successful from confronting that. I'm just curious how that came up.
Well, I mean, I think just to follow, it sort of relates to that question a bit, that once a place becomes gentrified, it becomes less challenging, and of course you price out people who might be truly creative, which is a problem. You had another part of the question? Could you say that again?
I don't know if there's any examples from your historical study of addressing
right.
that.
I would say that something really interesting from, say, ancient Athens is that, I was just leaving no stone unturned, so I looked into the possibility of food. It was an excuse to eat too. Like, was it the diet? Stay with me on this overlay. Was it the diet, the ancient Greek diet, that maybe explained their genius? So it turns out there's this restaurant in Athens called Ancien Gethys, which means ancient flavors, and they create this atmosphere where it's just like you're in 400 BC and you're eating just the food then. Like, so they didn't have tomatoes, so there's no tomato. They didn't have forks, they had knives and spoons. They only have knives and spoons. You know, oddly, the restaurant does take credit cards, so, you know, that's like, but it turns out the food was really bad. It was really plain and simple. They were just not foodies. And then something happened, and they became foodies, and they started to really get into that decadent foodie culture. And you can, I'm not saying there's a causation here, but there is a correlation between the Athenians becoming foodies and the decline of their civilization. So I think once places become over-gentrified and become a bit silly, if I can say that way, then your energy's going into finding just the perfect olive oil, you know, as opposed to thinking about other stuff. So gentrification has those two dangers, I think. Yes?
Hi. Do you believe that every civilization has its cluster of geniuses? And if so, for your research, how did you choose one civilization or golden age over another?
That's a really good question. Does every... You know, I realize this is not a very Washington thing to say, but I don't know whether every civilization had one. I do know that many, many do and did, and I do know that my process of winnowing it down and choosing these was very difficult. I had seriously considered a chapter on the Arab and Muslim Golden Age, which spanned actually more centuries than most, and spanned, you know, geographically, you know, from Morocco to Persia and probably further east than that. The sort of epicenters of the place, though, that, and again, I'm traveling for this book, were Baghdad and the House of Wisdom in 800 AD, and Damascus. And although I'm a former foreign correspondent, I was not prepared to go to those places at this time. I did not want my obituary to read, author dies while researching book on genius. But seriously, I felt very bad that I was not able to include that. I had toyed with including a chapter on Paris of the 1920s, but Woody Allen's movie, Midnight in Paris, had just come out. I thought it was overly familiar, but I came to regret that decision. True story, I get a call from, because the book's been translated into some 16 languages, but not French. And I get a call from the French publishers, says, Mr. Weiner, we like your book. It's very nice. We would like to publish it here in France, but why you don't have a chapter on the French geniuses? We have so many. That stung. So there are lots of places I could have included. I tried to go with a cross-section geographically, temporally across time, and in terms of familiarity. But good question.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi. This is a rather trivial question. Have you ever
There are no
watched-
trivial questions.
Oh, okay. Have you ever watched the series Silicon Valley?
Oh, this is trivial.
And if so, and,
No, just-
and if so, do you have any thoughts about it?
I have watched it. I met one of the guys, not who stars in it, but who's a venture capitalist named Roger McNamee, who appears in my book, and who was consulted by the producers of it, you know, and who makes a sort of cameo appearance in the series. And he thought it was spot on, and I think it does a good job of sort of puncturing the myth around it, right? And one of those myths is that Silicon Valley embraces failure, right? This failure fetish. Failure is good. You know, an early Silicon Valley pioneer said, oh, if you fail in Silicon Valley out here in the West, you know, far away from the East Coast, your neighbors won't, your family won't know and your neighbors won't care, you know, that kind of freedom. And there is some truth to that. But really, if you think about it, if you think about Steve Jobs and his backstory, we love the backstory of the failures because it ultimately led to success, right? And in fact, as one anthropologist points out to me, if you fail in Silicon Valley, you're working with a pretty big net, you know, because you can work again. These other places I looked at, if you failed, like in Renaissance Florence, you were done. You know, the stakes were higher. So the show's pretty good, I think, you know, what all good satire does, it exaggerates a bit, probably not as much as we think, to make a point, and it exaggerates the culture in order to illuminate the culture of Silicon Valley. So yeah, and it's funny. Don't forget that. Not trivial at all.
Hi, I was just wondering if you had any tips for application for those of us who might find ourselves in jobs that are like somewhat bureaucratic or limited by like working within a system. Did you find any tips within your research?
Which reminds me, I never answered the government question. I'm going to answer that one and then answer yours. I did not include Washington, D.C., even though I live here. And I don't think, this has probably not been a place of genius for a good couple hundred years, to be honest. I think because of the caution that comes with bureaucracy. You mentioned being sort of, if you're stuck in a bureaucratic job, or you're stuck somewhere, bureaucracy and creativity are pretty antithetical because of the cautiousness. There have been certainly institutions, you can say, that have produced things. The Manhattan Project was a group that was part of the federal government, right? But it was in New Mexico. They got them the hell out of Washington and said, go to New Mexico. And Bell Labs was, well, not government, was a corporation that produced lots of creative places. I think there are things you can do, and this is sort of one of the points in my book, is that, we don't need an ancient Florence or anything like that, but there are lessons. This is chock-a-block with things you can use to be less miserable in your job. One is you can go for a walk. Can you get out of your office? If you can, that's good, okay? Because lots of geniuses have walked. Beethoven was a walker, Freud was a walker, other people were walkers. There's something about walking that's very conducive to creativity. Go to a coffee shop if you can. Because there's the ideal decibel level, research shows, for creative thinking. It's not complete silence, and it's not really loud noise. It's about 70 decibels, that background din. I'm convinced this is one of the keys to Starbucks' success, that background din. And also, you can engage in some creative thinking exercises, such as what's called homeopathic thinking, taking two contradictory ideas and juxtaposing them and things like that. But I would caution you, and this is sort of the whole point of my book, is I think a lot of this creativity training that goes on in corporations and institutions is not that helpful if the people at the top are not open to these new ideas. You need someone at the top who's going to say, yes, let's run with that. Otherwise, you can have all the creative thinking exercises in the world, and you're just going to have a lot of frustrated creative employees. And on that kind of downer of a note, I'm going to have to say thank you very much. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.